You might not think the angle of a sputtering candle flame could change the course of a manuscript condemned to dust. Yet here we are, inside a cramped stone study where even the shadows move at a scholar's pace. Wax bowls in tiny title shapes along the brass saucer, and each lazy ripple decides whether the next word will lean left or right across the parchment. If you happen to remain awake by the time the wax cools into its final coastline, feel free to subscribe or simply keep drifting. The candle cares for neither metrics nor engagement. Above the desk, shelves sag under chained folios nobody dares unhook, not because they contain forbidden lore, but because their clasps squeak with the tone of a scolding ant. A small hourglass on the sill pretends to measure progress, though. It sand clumps from damp night air and refuses to fall unless coaxed by a fingertip. Monastic regulations once required the glass be flipped after every psalm, but the current occupant prefers to wait until the grains form a polite stalactite, arguing that disobedient sand inspires more thoughtful prose. Around the room hang diagrams of herbal roots colored like half-remembered vegetables. Their edges curl from heat, giving each carrot-shaped mandrake the posture of someone leaning in to gossip. No wind disturbs this scene, only the occasional sigh of parchment adjusting its opinion on humidity, yet the candle insists on flickering as though auditioning for a storm. Somewhere beyond the walls, a rook complains that dawn feels behind schedule, but here, in the study chamber, time obeys the scratch of a lone quill, which presently hovers, dips, and finally lands with the deliberation of a cat choosing where to nap. Ink spreads slowly, pooling at the tail of each letter before settling like dusk in a courtyard. The quill itself goose, recently retired from riverside commentary ticks against the surface in an irregular rhythm that could pass for rain if you close your eyes. From a distance, one might imagine secret revelations pouring onto the page. Yet much of the text describes administrative woes, the price of lamp oil when olives misbehave, the best angle to store vellum so mice mistake it for unseasoned leather, the problem of novices falling asleep during Latin declensions about brimstone. Every few lines, however, a spiky note intrudes, method for discerning shadow of pact. Vegetable test inconclusive, consult onion, reminding the parchment it serves both ledger and lantern. The writer pauses to blot a curious blot, then adds a parenthetical about quill maintenance. If nib splays, trim with humility. Scholars centuries later will decode this as an idiom for doctrinal caution, though it might simply mean keep your pen tidy. At the far edge of the desk rests a scrap bearing a single smudged word, possibly mercy or Mary, destined to confuse future footnotes. The quill resumes, its tip whistling faintly, a reminder that even instruments long for company. Should your eyelids feel heavy now, imagine the letters arranging themselves into a lullaby of careful serifs, each curve bowing as though to say, yes, the night is slow, and that is precisely the point. Stone corridors cool the air just enough to make torches crackle with wooden skepticism. An iron-bound door swings inward on well-oiled hinges, surprisingly courteous, considering its reputation, and reveals a room so bare it seems borrowed from an unfinished thought. In its center stands a table polished by centuries of elbows, though no evidence remains of which anxieties those elbows once supported. Shadows pool in the corners like shy auditors, reluctant to illuminate more than necessary. On one wall hangs a length of chain that now serves mainly to remind visitors of punctuality. Rust has soughed its menace into something resembling forgotten jewelry. Records indicate that architects calculated the room's dimensions to amplify echoes, yet masonry shifted over time, and now voices return only half-hearted, as though too sleepy to retrace their steps. A clerk arrives twice daily to dust the table with a square of linen, making gentle figure eights until even the motes drift off. He swears the stone smells of chalk and closed chalk from scraped notes, cloves from prayers whispered into sleeves, but acknowledges his nose may be rehearsing its own legend. On colder mornings, he lights a brazier whose coals settle into glowing constellations. Watching them yields the same calm as counting sheep, if sheep emitted occasional pops of resin. If you find your thoughts wandering here, let them settle. On the soft click of the brazier lid, a sound engineered unintentionally to mimic the closing of a sleepy pocket watch dot at the threshold of dawn, when parchment ghosts trade places with sparrow song, an open courtyard waits for its solitary ritual. Spellbooks, once catalogued with fastidious margin notes, now lie stacked in wobbling towers upon a squat stone altar. Their gilt tooling catches first light, flashing reminders of past dignity before surrendering to the business of ash. A young assistant stirs last night's embers with a hazel switch, not out of drama, but to ensure a breeze can guide the flames efficiently. He reads titles aloud as each volume meets the fire, his tone so gentle it might be mistaken for recitation of grocery staples, infusion of dew, refinement of toadstool, seasonal chart of virtue. One tome refuses to open wide enough for ignition, its binding swollen from years of humid speculation, so he props it upright like a reluctant accordion until heat persuades it to fan out. Pages curl inward first as if trying to plagiarize. Smoke, then float upward in fragments that resemble overcooked snowflakes. Local superstition claims these specks predict weather black flecks for rain, gray for ordinary cloud cover, but the assistant uses them only to gauge whether breakfast porridge might scorch if left unattended. The ash that remains is raked into neat lines resembling tiny frost ridges, then gathered into an urn stamped with a date no one will cross-reference. Eventually, the wind claims the lighter particles, distributing them across herb beds where sage grows particularly philosophical. Should you still be listening, notice how the fire crackles less like destruction and more like pages softly applauding their own conclusion. Leaving behind a warmth measured not in degrees, but in successfully concluded sentences. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, bells anticipate sunrise with a single muted clang, satisfied that day will manage without further rehearsal. Quill, candle, chain, and ash each settle into their appointed hush. The study door eases shut on a draft that smells faintly of melted wax and distant bread. Ink dries into a map of microscopic canyons no eye will explore tonight. The brazier exhales one last resin sigh before conceding to cool gray. Even the urn, brimful of powdered chapters, rests lighter than when the moon first noticed its shape. If your own thoughts have drifted to the edge of dreams, let them borrow the pillowcase wisdom of just enough opening, wide enough for comfort, narrow enough to stay put. Somewhere a candle agrees, guttering into morning while its last ember draws a perfect silent circle of soot, an unwritten period at the close of a sentence that never needed to hurry. You might not expect the empty strip of parchment that quietly frames a medieval page to have provoked heated ink calculations, formal ribbon ceremonies, and a symposium on whether silence should measure exactly 2 fingers or merely a generous thumb. Yep, here we are, drifting beside a monk who is busy not writing. He leans over his desk in a chilly scriptorium, candle glow pooling around his cowl, and spins long, slow breaths marking out nothing at all, the left margin by laying a bit of frayed string along the sheet. If you manage to remain awake by the time the string frays completely, feel free to subscribe, or simply tiptoe onward like the soft shadow of the quill itself. The monk's rule states that 12 syllables of spoken Latin must fit between text. An edge, an acoustic measurement that changes each day depending on choir fatigue. He hums a psalm fragment to test the gap and, satisfied, sets down a dot of red ink to indicate where a meaning must halt. Scholars later will misread the dot as secret code, though it represents the plainest portion of all, polite white air. The parchment sighs as his stylus pauses, acknowledging that unadorned space may be the most obedient apprentice in the room. Somewhere a distant goose honks, considering the honor of having donated its quill to mark so many unsaid words, and the candle flickers in agreement, casting brief waves that wander across the patient void like thoughts just out of reach. Centuries. Turn presses creak, and white space acquires a different supervisor, the printer's composing stick. In a narrow workshop that smells of ink and daylight strained through dusty windows, a typesetter pinches metal letters into a frame while mumbling fractions. He believes 3 picas of margin protect readers from accidental thumbprints, but his apprentice, who has recently learned French numbers, insists on 6 points because the figure sounds elegant in conversation. Their compromise becomes 4 picas and a friendly shrug, immortalized in the day's broadsides. Off to one side, a proofreader in wire spectacles measures the gap with the back of a fingernail, declaring it sufficiently contemplative. The foreman nods, presses groan. Paper accepts its new borders with the resignation of a meadow fenced for sheep. During lunch, the workers compare margin scraps, discovering that the offcuts curl into whimsical ribbons perfect for marking sandwiches. In a crowded basket, some joke that they have invented the bookmark, though monasteries quietly did so years earlier with leftover thread. If your eyelids droop at this point, consider how each upright piece of type casts a faint metal odor upon its surrounding silence, an aroma that settles like invisible snow along the inner edge of every printed sermon. Industrial rollers roll in, counting revolutions the way railways count telegraph poles and margins march toward uniformity. A London Standards Committee gathers in 1904 to decide whether textbooks should adopt a 1-inch boundary so school children may scrawl answers without trespassing on official listum. Tests are run. 30 pupils receive primers with generous margins, 30 without. The generous group doodles vines and improbable dragons, while the other crowd scribbles notes up the gutter, forcing teachers to rotate the pages like lazy windmills. Results are inconclusive, but stationers smell a market for extra-wide annotation zones, and so inch and quarter margins quietly win the day. America responds with binder ring fervor, advocating a left margin of 1 3/8. Inches so holes may punch through paper without nibbling verbs. European engineers counter that punched silence should be counted separately and propose a dual margin system, outer for beauty, inner for bolts, but the plan dissolves in a fog of polite metric arithmetic. Somewhere in transit, a paper salesman drops a ream, watching sheets glide across the pavement until curbstones arrest them precisely at their margins. He remarks that even wind respects blankness, a conclusion accepted by no academic journal, yet pleasing enough to share over tea. Modern screens arrive, glowing like domesticated constellations, and margins migrate into algorithms that call themselves default. Word processing software suggests 1-inch top, bottom, left, and right, as if symmetry were the final frontier. Users dutifully accept, though renegades nudge settings to 0.75 to save paper, then apologize to their printers when lines spill into the plastic hush. A statistics professor measures eye strain across varying margins by tracking pupil dilation. With a webcam, the data imply readers relax most when text occupies 2/3 of horizontal space, a ratio startlingly close to the monk's original string, though nobody present recalls Gregorian chant. Meanwhile, minimalist bloggers champion full bleed layouts where words kiss the edge like daredevils, but e-readers auto-pad them back, citing ergonomic hunches encoded deep in firmware. Somewhere in a cloud server, zeros and ones negotiate blank pixels the way monks once hummed intervals between syllables, a digital choir keeping time for eyes preparing to close. If you are still half listening, imagine the quiet margin expanding beyond the screen, filling the room with breathable stillness measured not in inches or picas, but in the gentle certainty that a pause, once granted, is rarely forgotten. And so the line of silence continues, unspooling from goose quills through metal swords, past screw-driven presses and into circuitry humming behind glass. Each era adds or subtracts a sliver, yet the margin's purpose remains the same, to let content inhale before it speaks, and to give weary eyes a soft ledge where they might rest. Place your palm beside the nearest sheet or glowing tablet. Feel the nothing that greets your skin, cool and obliging. That untouched border has been weighed by chant, squared by pica sticks, punched for binders, and padded by code. Also, thoughts can drift without colliding with the edge of their container. Let that measured emptiness guide your own thoughts. Now, widening just enough to cradle drowsiness, narrowing just enough to hold the gentle weight of closing lids. Words may resume someday, but the margin ever patient already knows how to wait. You might not expect that the soft sheet of mottled paper lounging beneath an inkwell could deliver parliamentary petitions, passionate measurements and eighth-inch disagreements, and one brief craze for rose-scented cellulose, yet here we are watching the centuries drift across a simple desk blotter. If you are still awake when we reach the moment a Victorian clerk argues that blotting paper should be judged by the echo of its sigh, feel free to subscribe or simply let your eyelids wander. Blotters specialize in absorbing decisions and indifference with equal courtesy. The first scene opens in a candlelit counting house where a scribe pauses after every column sums, lays a square of pale rag over the glistening ink, and presses with 3 fingertips as though testing dough. He lifts the sheet to inspect. The mirrored numerals, now hazy as distant chimney smoke, and arranges the blot beside a growing stack already speckled with yesterday's arithmetic. Medieval recipes advised shredding worn linen, soaking it in alum, then pressing the pulp between wooden boards tightened by rope. The resulting pads measured roughly the width of a monk's sleeve, a unit that never quite agreed from abbey to abbey. Some scholars stretched the standard to fit a generous silence around marginalia. Others trimmed it short to spare parchment, creating an accidental taxonomy of blotter dialects. The damp fibers hiss faintly just audible if you lean close as. Tiny air pockets collapse into restful arrangement. That hush becomes the evening's metronome, more reliable than the sagging hourglass nearby whose sand clumps like gossip. Should your mind wander, let it follow the gentle fade of ink footprints disappearing into the paper's cotton valleys, a miniature migration destined to remain quietly undocumented. A new century sways in smelling of coal and optimism, and stationers. Along the Thames roll out machine-calendared blotters in dignified rectangles, 11 inches by 9 if destined for law offices, 9 by 7 for pocket diaries, and the rebellious 3 by 5 slips favored by traveling salesmen who equate convenience with charm. Printers discover that blotters double as discreet advertisements. They coat one side with railway timetables, brewery slogans, or moral aphorisms, leaving the opposite obediently thirsty. Libraries complain that patrons begin hoarding blotters, not for ink, but for inspirational quotations about punctuality. A head librarian in Bath institutes a one-per-visit policy, which patrons circumvent by visiting repeatedly under different hats. In Philadelphia, a modest chemist dusts talc between sheets to prevent premature adhesion, coining the term non-cling leaves, though buyers mishear it as non-clean and assume extra absorption. Amid these incremental flourishes, the question of ideal size lingers like unscented glue. Clerks argue that wider blotters pamper flourishing signatures, while bookkeepers insist narrow pads encourage fiscal restraint. A compromise emerges, 8 inches across, a figure easy, to fold into ledgers without bruising columns, and yet broad enough to cradle a hesitant autograph. If sleep edges closer, imagine those pads waiting in neat cascades upon wooden counters, each sheet resembling a silent snowfall about to absorb the footprints of ink. The third scene unfurls in a telegraph office, humming with brass clicks and cigarette murmurs. Operators tap out messages, then flip levers to ink receipts that must blot before cables resume their sprint. Here, speed muscles into the debate. Tests reveal that sheets trimmed to exactly 7 inches require half a second less arm travel. From blotter tray to message pad, over a 12-hour shift that saves 1,000 blinks enough, supervisors claim to keep eyelids alert through midnight storms. A stopwatch study verifies nothing useful, but management still engraves 7-inch efficiency onto the dispenser lid. Meanwhile, upper floors host gentlemen drafting polite petitions on heavier cream stock, demanding blotters wider than 10 inches lest their fountain pens splash grandiose loops. The telegraph foreman observes that hierarchy thus governs blotter girth. Urgency prefers slim, ceremony favors broad. A junior clerk, tasked with ordering supplies, chooses 9 inches just to remain invisible in the middle. The paper mill obliges, slicing reels with a blade they call the diplomat, because everyone leaves content enough to postpone the argument. Outside, pigeons roost on telegraph wires, practicing punctuation contests of their own, while inside, ink dries to the rhythm of Morse lullabies. If thoughts begin to blur, let them mimic the gentle widening and narrowing of these historic dimensions, each size a hammock stretched between necessity and whim. Sunlight from fluorescent tubes settles onto mid-century metal desks where typewriters clatter like optimistic hail. The carbon ribbons leave bold strokes that dry quickly, but signatures still require blotting, especially now that ballpoint pens sneak globs of oil-based ink across bristleboard paper. Office managers, enamored with modular furniture, standardize in trays sized exactly 8.5 by 4 inches, half of the letter sheet and compatible with staplers that promise jamless futures. Design magazines applaud the sleek symmetry, calling it the golden mean of absorption, though golden means little to a sheet whose destiny is mottled twilight. Marketing departments perfume select pads with a hint of rose, an aroma said to counteract cigarette haze. Typists complain the scent masks carbon fluid, making it hard to gauge when ribbons gasp their last. Sales data falter, rose retreats, and plain unscented blotters regain their throne. Yet a faint whiff lingers in archival boxes, proof that paper remembers even abandoned fashions. By now, you may sense your own breath aligning with these iterations, each inhale slightly wider, each exhale gently narrower, mirroring the quiet saga of inches negotiated into calm utility. Late computers whisper promises of paperless calm, but pens persist and ink still seeks refuge. Designers of digital tablets study historical blotter ratios before coding virtual. Margins that fade when tapped, a nostalgic nod to absorption without residue. The International Organization for Standardization considers but ultimately shelves a proposal to codify blotter length, reasoning that diversity fosters creativity, or perhaps they fell asleep mid-committee, lulled by the soft rustle of sample. Pats. In quiet studios, calligraphers continue ordering custom sheets a full foot wide because flourish remains the heartbeat of their craft. Eco-minded sketchers redeem offcuts, trimming them into 6x4 rectangles admired for their pocket-friendly humility. Somewhere, a high-speed printer ejects the final test strip of cyan and magenta, which lands on the sacrificial blotter below, proof that even lasers like to leave footprints. That pad, measured to no standard but the width of the technicians. Lunchbox absorbs the blot with ancient patience, its fibers opening like quiet mouths. Pick up any current blotter and hold it to the light. You'll see faint constellations where earlier inks kissed the pulp, each asteroid crater a retired exclamation now softened to a whisper. Edge to edge, the sheet records its own cartography, continents of midnight blue slowly fading to inland. Seas of gentle gray, the distance from one border to the other, be it 7 inches, 8, or the eccentric 10 matters less than the softness of that span. The invitation it extends to error and immediacy alike. Rest your thumb upon it and feel nothing but the absence of resistance, the subtle yield that convinces spilled words they were meant to land just so. If slumber hovers nearby, trust that the blotter, grandchild of linen rags and machine knives, will hold any stray thought that drips as your mind tilts toward dreams. It asks no signature, requires no standard, only that you allow its quiet. Bravery to cradle one more pause, exactly as wide as it needs to be. You might not expect that the shy curve of a metal wire, flattened and folded into something smaller than a fingernail, could launch correspondence between patent clerks who preferred naps, ignite measuring spats in half-millimeter increments, and inspire a brief fad for a lavender-scented flux. Yet here we are, trailing the gentle evolution of staple leg length. If you're still awake by the time one earnest engineer proposes that the ideal staple should enter paper with the confidence of a well-sharpened crayon, feel free to subscribe, though the staples will click shut without any official signatures. The first scene opens in a candlelit counting room of the 1840s, where ledgers sprawl like domesticated horizons and clerks rely on ribbons, pins, and polite gravity to keep columns aligned. A visiting French watchmaker, more familiar with miniature springs than account books, idly bends a thin strip of brass into a rectangle, taps it through 2 pages, and folds the legs back like sleepy antennae. The invention behaves more like an afterthought than a revolution, yet the senior clerk instantly praises the device for making papers feel decisively married. Early copies vary wildly. Some legs measure a stout 9 millimeters, better suited for parchment than the airy new rag stock. Others shrink to a cautious 5, vanishing into the page like bashful stitching. A shop catalog calls them paper cramps, an image that convinces no one to hurry. Still, small tins appear beside inkwells, each containing a lopsided bouquet of proto-staples waiting to practice commitment. Industrial presses soon intervene, shearing ribbon wire into identical twins. The question of leg length becomes less philosophical and more mechanical. Longer legs demand deeper jaws and therefore taller casings. Shorter legs save metal but risk skimming away at the slightest tug. An 1873 patent from Massachusetts fixes on 11/16 of an inch because the inventor notes that's the span between his thumb joint and thumbnail, a metric available on demand. Across the Atlantic, London stationers compromise at 15 millimeters purely because the conversion chart was misplaced and someone mistrusted fractions before T. The disparity spawns 2 polite empires. American legs stride boldly, arcing like tiny suspension bridges across thick legal paths. British counterparts prefer a demure hop over fewer pages, claiming elegance trumps bulk. Clerks comparing imports tuck a ruler into jacket cuffs and measure discreetly, the way botanists might size an unexpected fern. Micro hook, when Glasgow accountant secretly files invoices by staple length, convinced longer legs correlate with optimism and billing dot by the turn of the century. Staple crowns widen to match the growing appetite for carbon copies, machines. Must punch not 2, but sometimes 5 sheets, each carrying its own faint mirror of ink supposition. Engineers tinker with leverage until someone realizes that longer legs do not guarantee deeper penetration. Too much wire bends before clearing. The last carbon. Tests ensue. Neat stacks of paperweight, humidity recorded, legs of 10, 11, 12 millimeters fired at intervals like drowsy artillery. After 50 trials, the lab concludes a curious plateau between 9.5 and 10.5 millimeters. The staple performs identically, the difference lost in paper squish. The report recommends Choose whichever looks reassuring on packaging. Marketing departments celebrate with embossed tins declaring 10 millimeters ideal, quietly ignoring that neighboring. Factories will stamp 11 millimeters optimum by lunch. Light punchline. Optimum apparently enjoys plural citizenship. Warriors redirect metal and priorities. Staple makers experiment with iron coated in whatever will placate ration board zinc. Tin, a flirtation with cellophane wrap that peels. At humidity. Sure, 6 millimeter legs rise to prominence because they conserve wire. Staplers adopt punch and crimp jaws shaped like minimalist pliers. Soldiers refer to them as stitches that don't itch, a compliment to both brevity and rust resistance. Post-war offices inherit these lean staples, now accustomed to feeding voracious filing cabinets. Yet prosperity brings thicker reports, glossier pages, and the inevitable request for something sturdier. In 1952, a Swedish firm releases the Gustav 14, boasting 14 millimeter legs tipped in chrome. Reviewers note the staple can fasten 25 pages without complaint, and 40 with cheerful protest. Competitors retaliate by extending their own legs to 15, then 15 and a quarter, until patent drawings resemble botanical charts of creeping vines. Soft irony. A Chicago newspaper concludes the arms race ends when leg length matches the width of the stapler itself, declaring victory by geometry.electric staplers hum into being, promising uniform drive no matter the load. Their solenoids prefer shorter legs excess wire rattles and jams the feeder. Manuals recommend 8 millimeters for daily memos, 10 only for ambitious collations. Office supply catalogs respond with modular boxes labeled SML, calibrated not to clothing, but to thickness measured in standard ream units, which sound authoritative yet disguise the mystery that paper weight changes with humidity faster than anyone's sandwich dries. A micro hook arrives in the form of a memo. An Australian clerk uses the wrong leg size and staples a budget forecast to his lunch bag. Finance records a deficit in mustard stains. Humor drifts in softly, like the scent of stationary glue heating. Under desk lamps, computers promise to abolish paper and, by extension, the staple. Instead, printouts multiply like thoughtful snow. Laser printers spit collated packets yearning for a simple pinch. Engineers invent reversible staples whose legs curl inward rather than outward, allowing removal without hiss or tear. Such designs require exact leg length, 12 millimeters, to arc gracefully without cuddling toner. A Japanese consortium tests 90 variants and lands on 11.2 because rounding would insult precision. The specification travels via glossy pamphlets, accompanied by diagrams of smile-shaped staples hugging page corners. Pages everywhere remain stoically unaware. Still, a sleepy thrill passes through procurement offices. The tide of leg length turns by tenths now, a ballet of decimals that rarely wakes the coffee machine. Green movement's petition for staples made. Of recycled cans. Aluminum legs soften, necessitating chubby 13 millimeter lengths to counteract pliability. Environmental labels boast footprints so light they barely dent spreadsheets, though rumor insists aluminum legs whistle on descent, a lullaby for late shifts. Meanwhile, archivists warn of galvanic reactions with high-acid paper, advocating stainless steel recoated in neutrality. Their staple, 9 millimeters, lean enough to avoid heavy metal gilt, stout enough for a century of silence. Debate blurs again, long for strength, short for purity, medium for diplomacy. The International Standards Organization hosts a webinar attendance, muted to suggest a friendly corridor of 8 to 12 millimeters, crown width 13 plus or minus 1. Nobody riots. Spreadsheets update. Staples keep arriving in identical beige boxes. Hold a modern staple now between fingertip and thumb. Its legs angle inward at roughly 60 degrees, poised like miniature ski jumpers awaiting snow. Wiggle slightly and feel. The yield point where a metal chooses compliance over argument. At 8 millimeters, the legs promise swift entry and tidy exit. At 10, they vow to embrace an extra heartbeat of pages. At 12, they offer steadfastness that borders on clingy affection. Stack of paper, whisper of teeth meeting anvil, a momentary. Crunch softer than a cookie crumb underfoot, then calm as the wire kneels into folded ribs. That serene fold is the quiet punctuation of bureaucracy. The metal lull after ink speaks dot of drowsiness taps your shoulder. Imagine stable legs marching. Down a conveyor belt, measured by laser's tiniest dust motes, each wire snipped to length with a sigh no human hears. Picture them boxed, shipped, unboxed, loaded into a spring magazine, waiting in darkness until a palm descends to guide that single decisive snap. Across decades and desks, leg lengths have wandered back and forth like tide lines, yet every variation serves the same sleepy purpose, to hold what matters just long enough and no longer while twilight pages lie still. Allow that measured grip to cradle your own thoughts, keeping stray worries from fluttering loose until morning finds its place. Staple ready, legs quietly sufficient, length exactly adequate for another gentle day. You might not expect that the invisible space between two neat circles nibbled from the edge of a sheet, just the quiet interval of paper that survives a hole punch, could inspire imperial edicts, metric manifestos, and a short-lived contest. To name the most philosophical gap, yet here we are, drifting beside clerks who spend their shift measuring nothing at all. If you're still awake when we reach the moment a Swiss accountant claims the optimal distance between holes equals the span of a mid-morning yawn, feel free to subscribe. Or simply drift. The rings will close regardless of audience applause, dot in a dusky London registry of the 1840s. Correspondence piles like ill-trained pigeons. Brassmans do their best to tame the flock, but pens prick fingers and rip margins. So a minor inventor named Brian Duncan produces a punch that drops 2 crescents a tidy 2 inches apart. He chooses the measure because his pocket ruler's first visible mark is smudged. 2 inches looks honest enough. Clerks applaud the breath of fresh space. It lets pages swivel like mild weathercocks on string ties, and soon the distance becomes local gospel. Early ledgers show neat paired moons framing ink blotches where pins once lived. Yet cross the channel and a Paris notary swears by 54 millimeters, allegedly the width of a respectable handshake minus the thumb. Thus, even before trains agree on a timetable, paper has stumbled into its own gentle border dispute. The gap widens both literally and diplomatically when Swedish engineer Andreas Tangwall patents a 2-hole punch in 1889, setting the distance at 80 millimeters. He claims the number pleases his drafting compass, which clicks firmly into place at that radius. Swedish ministries adopt the gap overnight, finding it aligns with no previous folder but feels satisfyingly symmetrical, like eyebrows brushed into agreement. German bureaucrats, enamored with precision, round the figure down to exactly 8.0 centimeters, printing the ratio on the still throat of every punch in stern Gothic lettering, as though the tool might forget. British offices glance at Continental. Charts shrug and keep 2 inches because changing would mean retraining the T-trolley to navigate wider binders. A micro hook drifts in, 1 London. Solicitor secretly owns both punches and decides which spacing to use based on the client's accent, thereby pioneering bilingual paperwork before language software was even a rumor dot across the Atlantic. Paper becomes letter-sized, carriages clang, and 3-ring binders stage a polite coup. In 1899, Chicago firm Wilson Jones proposes that 3 holes at precisely 4.25 inches center to center will cradle pages like a supportive armchair. The extra ring claims to prevent shelf sag. a phrase that sounds orthopedic but convinces. Schools to adopt the system for adolescent notebooks prone to rough backpack travel. Whole spacing settles into a friendly 108mm cadence between outer rings. Purely an accident of inches rendered in metric, Canadian printers adopt both 2-hole European and 3-hole American patterns, packaging drill bits like bilingual dictionaries. Warehouse loaders joke that maple syrup might stick better with 4 holes, but no one files a patent before lunch. Electric punches whir into post-war offices, their motors humming softer than fluorescent lights. Adjustable slides promise freedom, 70mm for invoices, 80mm for Nordic invoices, 100mm if you believe in archival grandeur. Yet users rarely move the guide once set. Paperwork loves running into habit. A Danish typist tapes her preferred, setting 75mm by anchoring a paperclip in the slot, an innovation later marketed as the single-click memory stop. Manuals print conversion tables, inch to millimeter, millimeter to smile of regional supervisor. Somewhere in an appendix, a footnote warns that poorly centered holes may cause binder cough, the squeak emitted when misaligned sheets shuffle. Technicians attempt to quantify the cough in decibels, but abandon the experiment after giggling into the silent stack room. Computers threaten to retire punches, but printers retaliate by turning forests into pie charts nobody actually reads on screen. Digital templates include dotted guidelines showing exactly where holes will appear once data becomes tactile. The ISO, ever cautious, publishes 838, 2 holes, 80mm apart, 12mm from the edge, as if describing a small constellation only bureaucrats can see. Ironically, the standard arrives just as tech companies rediscover disc-bound notebooks, their mushroom-shaped slots mocking conventional rings and rendering spacing moot. For a season, you can spot engineers flipping pages with satisfying clicks that sound like distant billiards. Yet audits still demand punched binders, and the gap indoors, measured, adjusted. Quietly fulfilling dot, hold a punched page to lamplight now. The twin circles or neat trio glow like lunar phases arranged. For convenience, slide a finger along the bridge of uncut paper between them. Feel how weightless thickness can become when drilled into absence. Whether the interval spans 54mm or 80mm or the patriotic 4.25 inches, it welcomes steel rings with the same small nod. That nod is centuries old, born of smudged rulers, confident compasses, and afternoon yawns turned into policy. Let it. Lull your own thoughts into line, each worry sliding onto its ring, resting without tear or pinprick, supported by exactly as much nothingness as history currently recommends. You might not expect that the nearly invisible rectangle of thin plastic shimmering on the face of an otherwise forgettable envelope could summon postal decrees, boardroom slide rules, and a single-season obsession with anti-fog coating. Yet here we are, drifting alongside clerks who have spent entire careers measuring the proper width of a view window. If you're still awake by the time, one earnest engineer proposes that transparency should feel no warmer than a cautious handshake. Feel free to subscribe, but please don't strain. Like letters themselves, this ramble will arrive with or without a stamp of approval. It begins in a lamp mansion shop of the 1840s, where invoices pile high, each needing its recipient read without revealing the silver shillings tucked within. A pragmatic stationer slices a thumb-sized cavity in the paper, then pastes. Behind it, a scrap of oiled silk thin enough for ink to wink through, thick enough to deflect rain. At first, the aperture hovers wherever scissors decide, but soon he settles on 7/8 of an inch from the left, edge because that distance shelters the addressee line from fidgety thumbs. Customers praise the silk's whispery sheen. Postal. Clerks mutter that sunlight reflects unbearably, so the stationer begins roughening the surface with pumice. inventing privacy frosting decades before glass architects claim it as their own. Somewhere in the background, a stray kitten tests each envelope stack for nap potential, proving that window height initially a full inch makes an adequate pillow only when the kitten curls diagonally dot as rotary presses multiply. Envelope windows migrate into uniformity. A Boston patent of 1872 fixes the opening at 1¼ inches tall, 3 wide, extolling the golden rectangle of efficient gaze. Yet printers across the Atlantic prefer metric reassurance and adopt 30-70 millimeters, an approximation just sloppy enough to irritate compasses. German bureaucrats slice theirs exactly, 32 millimeters from the top fold, so the address avoids abrupt mustaches drawn by roller ink. French notaries, disliking prime numbers, bump placement to 35 and assure themselves it feels more poetic. Micro hook. A Paris clerk secretly keeps 2 rulers, 1 imperial, 1 metric, and alternates daily, believing the subtle misalignment encourages auditor drowsiness. Meanwhile, plastic films replace oiled silk. Cellophane enters with rustling applause, only to crinkle under winter dryness. Engineers add glycerin to soften the sheet, discovering that too much renders addresses watery. Too little invites static that lures every breadcrumb in the post office. Eventually, they settle on a film measuring exactly 55 microns, thin enough to flap when breathed upon, thick enough to survive the wheeze of sorting machines older than their. Operator's anecdotes that scene shift arrives under fluorescent. Tubes of a 1950s mailroom where letters zip through conveyor rollers like timid sleds. Automation demands windows be centered within plus or minus 2 millimeters, postal squint tolerance, a phrase typed in manuals as though eyeballs calibrate machinery. One day a tray of envelopes punches through a sorter gate because their windows sit a sneeze too low. The resulting paper avalanche blocks the time clock and grants workers an unscheduled tea break. Quality inspectors respond by fitting punches with alignment lasers borrowed from watchmaking cousins. Beams glitter across stacks, transforming the workshop into a sleepy planetarium where constellations name themselves after postal districts. Answering the riddle of fog, a chemist dusts the plastic with silica so microscopic that droplets hesitate to perch. Marketers dub it Clearview Calm, though rain-heavy postbags prove calm is relative. By now, the standard window measures 1/8 inches high, 4.5 wide, an elegant gasp, large enough for zip codes to stretch their legs, small enough to stop nosy index fingers. Yet every printer's ruler still shows half-worn pencil marks at slightly different points, testifying that precision often lounges in the shade of approximation. Late century ushers and laser bills, printed through address windows by the million. Software guides text boxes to land perfectly behind openings, but fonts sulk or swagger, bumping letters upwards like stage divas seeking better spotlight. Programmers introduce fudge factors, 4-point downward nudges here, 2-point left shifts there so digital addresses behave. Someone jokes these margins of error equal the size of customer patience. A micro hook floats past. An Australian utility once mailed 80,000 invoices offset by ½ inch, revealing not names but the cheerful words, insert footer here. Recipients treated it as postmodern poetry. Accountants sighed and widened the window by 3 millimeters the following quarter, declaring it future-proof. Meanwhile, eco-designers swap clear plastic for translucent paper made from sugarcane pulp. It glows like candle wax, diffusing names into cloud shapes that satisfy privacy auditors but puzzle optical scanners. Trials conclude the haze must transmit at least 70% luminance to keep machines civil. Manufacturers craft charts of sunlight angles comparing winter gloom to scanner bulbs. Each data bar shaped like a gentle nap dot. Our final drift settles in an online era still fettered to physical mail for tax forms and sentimental invoices. International. Standard ISO 216 whispers that the window should appear either 20 millimeters from the left or 45 millimeters, depending on regional etiquette, proving that indecision ages gracefully. Envelope factories install multi-tool slitters capable of sliding between specs like Lullaby's switching key. Office supply catalogs list standard, executive, and continental windows whose differences could hide inside a drowsy grain of rice. Somewhere a robotics startup mails invitations inside envelopes whose windows are heat sensitive, rub gently, and the invite text blooms like shy ink. Forget to rub, and the scanner reads nothing, granting the envelope an introvert's dignity. Postal historians gather at a symposium to debate whether this counts as a new chapter in window dimension or merely a fashionable shrug. Consensus defers itself until after lunch, at which time everyone wanders off to the gift shop, buying postcard reproductions of the very first, oiled silk specimen and remarking how small the opening seems in person. Hold any window envelope. To lamplight now? Note the slight shimmer where adhesive frames the film, a border of quiet confidence. Measure if you wish, perhaps it spans 114.45 millimeters. Perhaps a modest 14.125 inches, but more likely it simply offers enough. Clarity to carry your name across town without revealing the size you typed above your signature. That measured rectangle, product of centuries of shrugging adjustments, invites your eyes to rest a moment, like small birds sheltering in a garden trellis. Let the remaining paper around it stand as a hedge against curiosity and mother alike. A lull in an otherwise restless page, and if, while gazing through that humble pane, your own thoughts decide to nestle behind softly closing lids, trust the window will keep watch precisely wide enough, gently tall enough, quietly perfect, for sleep to slip through. You might not expect that the slim brass frame dangling on the front of a filing cabinet drawer, the little window where a label peeks out like a shy name tag, could spur patent attorneys to sharpen pencils, inspire factory foremen to calibrate, punch presses in 1/16 inch lurches, and create a brief but earnest fad for velvet-lined card slots. Yet here we are, drifting through the measured hush of label slot history. If you find yourself still awake by the time one Michigan inspector describes the ideal slot as being wide enough for optimism, narrow enough for regret, feel free to subscribe or simply let the drawer glide shut while you drowse. The brass corners will keep their union meeting without you. It begins in an 1820s counting house, where ledgers smell of ink and damp tweed. Drawers are humble pine trays, each bearing a hand-cut notch scarcely larger than a postage stamp. Clerks slip folded scraps into these notches, hoping the paper stays upright long enough to announce its contents. Good drawers sag under the weight of coin receipts. Bad drawers swallow their own labels until only blank lid stares back. A London cabinet maker named Ephraim Lark decides the notch deserves a collar, so he bends a ribbon of tin into a rectangle just under 2 inches wide, nails it over the void, and slides the label behind the metal with a satisfied hum. 2 inches is not a measurement of study. It merely matches the width of his thumbnail plus the half moon of habit. Still, merchants admire how neatly Spice Duties sits within the gleam and orders trickle in. Before long, Lark's apprentices crank out frames in haphazard lengths, some a comfortable 2 1/8, some a frugal inch and 7/8, barking friendly squabbles about whether extra brass implies extra gravitas. In the evenings, they test fits with scraps torn from shipping bills, inventing the first unofficial standard. A label slot should admit a slip rescued from a trouser pocket without requiring a blush or a fold. Somewhere in the rafters, dust motes settle on newly minted frames, approving each width with the slow democracy of gravity dot steam presses and steel shears soon replace tinsmith thumbs. Across the Atlantic, an Ohio foundry stamp slots exactly 2 1/4 inches wide, because that dimension nests 3 up across a scrap plate with no waste. Office supply catalogs trumpet the measurement as continental clarity, implying Europe somehow nodded in advance. European makers, meanwhile, embrace 55 millimeters close enough to the American figure to avoid ally estrangement, but metric enough to satisfy. Parisian exhibitions. Librarians enter the chat next, brandishing Dewey Decimals that sprawl. Like evening vines, they petition for a taller slot an inch high so numbers can stretch their ascenders without bumping headers. Manufacturers grumble, taller frames require longer rivets. Longer rivets invite crookedness. Crookedness tempts complaint. Eventually, compromise materializes at 7/8 of an inch tall, stamped into brochures in proud copperplate. Micro-hook surfaces every half minute or so. A Dutch clerk insists on 8/8, high because half numbers deserve full dignity, thereby minting the quietest mathematical rebellion in cabinet lore.c transition slopes into a 1920s. Urban Records office humming with the syncopated click of typewriters. Drawers now slide on steel runners greased with lanolin. Each bears a label slot aligned precisely 5/8 of an inch from the top edge, so stacked units form tidy horizons. Inspectors patrol with calipers, reading to thousands, claiming misalignment upsets the ocular serenity of staff. One summer, heat bends frames into slight smiles. Panic ensues until someone discovers chilling them in ice water restores compliance, leading to the annual ritual of dunking rogue hardware. In buckets like metallic cucumbers. During tea breaks, clerks debate whether a beveled edge makes the slot appear larger. A consensus forms that bevels merely invite dust to contemplate residence, so straight sides prevail. Meanwhile, printing houses sell pre-cut card strips. 48 millimeters wide, boasting the cards, kiss, both brass flanges simultaneously, an erotic metaphor no one requests but everyone repeats. By now, slot width hovers between 50 and 60 millimeters worldwide, not through decree, but through what one trade journal calls international politeness by approximation. If your eyelids float, imagine these frames clinking down conveyor lines, each ringing a faint note like a xylophone played by caution. The third scene flickers under fluorescent tubes of a 1960s municipal archive. Plastic arrives, transparent and unapologetic, clicking into place where brass once shone. Polycarbonate frames mold effortlessly to 60 millimeters because the injection dies like round numbers. Archivists relish the extra millimeter for hand-typed microfilm codes, but fret about static cling trapping lint. Manufacturers dust frames with an ethereal anti-static mist, scented faintly of vanilla, leading some archivists to believe the cabinets now emit pastry encouragement. A micro-hook rolls past. One New Zealand clerk gains local fame for tasting the frames to confirm flavor, only to report they taste of nothing, yet his legend endures longer than his employment. Amid this, an ANZI committee gathers to propose 2.25 inches as the American official width, mostly to reassure wholesalers that cartons may be labeled confidently. Europe responds with ISO 8958 millimeters for card size, leaving slot aperture at 64 to 66 millimeters, a gap they argue allows for dignified retrieval with gloved fingers. The amplitude of acceptance stretches, yet no design collapses from the weight of these pageant figures. Drawers continue to slide, identifications continue to peep through their modest windows. Finally, we drift into our own lit century where digital files quietly elbow metal drawers aside, yet physical archives refuse to surrender. Boutique. Stationary brands resurrect brass frames, marketing them as heritage accents measured in poetic fractions, 2 inches and a whisper. Laser cutters etch edges so sharp they tingle like distant sleigh bells when tapped. An eco-startup fashions frames from pressed coffee grounds, bonding them with resin that smells faintly of rain-soaked mornings. Coffee frames shrink too, percent during curing, settling at an accidental but apparently perfect 54 millimeters. Bloggers swoon, printers shrug, librarians sniff the air for caffeine. Meanwhile, cloud software still prints patient barcodes to be filed and climate controlled. Boxes, each barcode precisely 48 millimeters wide to match a frame spec written when men wore fedoras daily. International standards bodies propose retiring caliper patrol but quietly keep the job code alive because somebody must measure. The latest handbook reads, slot width 50 to 65 millimeters, slot height 10 to 25 millimeters, position within good taste. Good taste being unmeasurable, the range may linger forever. Hold any cabinet label frame to lamplight now. Notice its edges, perhaps straight, perhaps beveled, perhaps smelling of soft espresso or faint brass polish. Slide a fingertip across the aperture. Feel the tiny horizon where card meets air. That distance, maybe 2 1/8 inches, maybe 55 millimeters, stands as a tidy breath between chaos and order wide enough to name memories, narrow enough to keep them from drifting away. Let your own stray thoughts nestle behind that window tonight, each idea slipped into place, its title peering through with quiet confidence. The frames will stand watch, measured but unhurried, until morning opens fresh drawers with the gentlest possible pull. You might not expect that the slender strip of spring steel perched on the cap of a fountain pen, the quiet clip that helps a scholar keep ink close to a shirt pocket, could summon patent diagrams, boardroom tests involving barrels of ball, bearings, and a minor gold rush for alloyed phosphor bronze. Yet here we are, drifting beside engineers who spent decades measuring the ideal gram force of poised restraint. If you're still awake by the time one Copenhagen stationer proposes that clip tension should imitate the polite firmness of a librarian's shush. Feel free to subscribe though, like most clips, this ramble will carry on gripping gently. Even if no one hitches a ride, early 19th century pens crossed oceans without clips at all, rolling freely in coat linings like adventurous marbles. But when train travel shook carriages enough to scatter quills onto dusty floors, a New York jeweler soldered a crude brass claw onto a silver barrel, pinched it around a money order stub, and declared the device pocket ready. Claw squeezed with whatever force the torch's temper allowed, sometimes soft as overboiled spaghetti, sometimes fierce enough to dent a waistcoat. Customers complained and clapped equally. No one kept records of how many waistcoats were. Sacrificed before a consensus formed that 3 ounces of pinch felt about right. 3 ounces was not a scientific unit, really. The weight of a half-filled inkwell the jeweler used as makeshift gauge, but soon his apprentices calibrated by hanging that inkwell from fresh clips until the tension matched the jeweler's. Satisfied nod. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a Birmingham penmaker drilled twin rivets into nickel silver and let the clip dangle loose enough to sway like a tired flag. He argued that gravity would take care of holding, though gravity seemed busy elsewhere. One micro hook drifts in. A barrister purchases both designs, stores one in a ledger, one in a waistcoat, and discovers the fierce clip tears the ledger, while the gentle clip escapes the waistcoat during a bow, leaving an ink mustache on polished boots, thereby launching the first recorded case of clip litigation over unintended footwear decoration. Factories hummed through the 1890s, stamping clips from ribbon steel, and soon a quiet arms race emerged over how many pages of correspondence a clip could lift without losing temper. Chicago engineers built a rig resembling a sleepy carnival crane. Each clip grasped a stack of blank sheets, rising until it whimpered free. Charts revealed that 7-gram steel held 10 sheets, while 9-gram manganese steel held 15-bit pockets like a cranky crab. Marketing teams proclaimed firm yet forgiving springs measuring exactly 6.5 grams of return force. Those scales of the era confessed accuracy mostly in fractions of bacon. Meanwhile, German mechanics adopted beryllium copperweight springy, politely non-magnetic, and set their standard at 70 centinewtons, a number chosen because it filled the brochure line with symmetrical digits. A micro hook passes. A Swiss watchmaker tests clips by securing them around the minute hand of a dismantled clock, relying on spring recoil to reset gears. No watch leaves the bench, but clip tolerance tables now sport notations like good. For horological flirtations, puzzling future archivists, a new century arrives smelling of vulcanite and optimism. Companies such as Waterman and Parker commission in-house pocket friction laboratories, where lab-coated technicians seek clips over felt-lined dowels, then yank them off with miniature dynamometers that squeak approvingly at 90 grams per pull. Reports insist 90 grams is the median comfort between accidental tumble and fabric bruise. Across the corridor, a rival lab discovers 82 grams bears silk blouses from memory dents, so catalogs suddenly advertise. 82 grams satin safe retention. Neither figure survives a third study conducted by a French insurer who claims 60. 5 grams prevents claim filings altogether. To reconcile, the fledgling STM offers a corridor 60 to 90 grams, thereby summarizing years of argument into a range wide enough to nap inside. By now, you may feel a drowse approaching. Imagine those clips lined in velvet trays, each waiting its turn to nip felt cylinders in an endless waltz of measured, muffled clicks. World War II diverts nickel into aircraft, copper into bullets. So pen clips pivot to austere aluminium alloys. Aluminium's memory proves short. Clips bend open like daydreaming daffodils. To compensate, suppliers lengthen the clip foot, allowing more leverage without bruising pages. Thus, a new metric emerges: overhang distance. British naval procurement demands clips no longer than 19 millimeters from fulcrum to toe, citing pocket knife safety guidelines. American PX stores accept 22 because G is fancy thicker field notes. Post-war prosperity reintroduces gold plating, yet springs remain steel, sandwiched between rivet and jewel cabochon. Tension returns to the mid-70s. Grams warm enough to cling, cool enough to forgive. One micro hook. A Tokyo stationery house discovers their lacquer barrels crack under 80+ gram. Pressure during humid monsoons. They respond by carving subtle vent grooves beneath the clip, marketing them as Zen breathing channels, inadvertently inventing the modern cap ring. Electric calculators appear on desks, but fountain pens refuse retirement. The 1970s witness. The rise of pocket protectors, vinyl shields, negating clip tension entirely. Engineers panic. If nylon holsters hold pens, do clips matter? Focus groups suggest clips still perform too. Critical tasks preventing barrel roll and signaling dignity when pens display upright in conference pockets. Designers thus pivot to aesthetics: gold arrowheads, swooping swans, minimalist bars aligned exactly 5 millimeters below cap finials. Tension stabilizes at 65 grams, a figure laminated onto quality control cards, stamped with Sunrise logos. A micro hook again. A Danish ergonomist measures pupil dilation while volunteers pocket-on-pocket pens at various tensions. He concludes, 63 grams is visually soothing, but funding dries before peer review. Digital tablets threaten to delete handwriting, yet fountain pens sign treaties, luxury leases, and diaries best kept offline. Modern ISO guidelines whisper that clip force between 1 and 1.3 newtons suffices for cotton shirting. Anything above 1.6 risks long-term crease memory. Factories deploy laser torque sensors that ping green for compliance, red for rebellion. Clips failing calibration spend exile in barrels marked retemper. Saunas where 320 degrees Celsius air restores humility. Eco Brand's toy with recycled brass trimmed to 62 grams because annealed soda metal cannot bear more. Meanwhile, 3D printers spit nylon clips tinted plum and seafoam, their tension unpredictable until post-cure. Hobbyists share spreadsheets rating each batch by pocket hubs. Somewhere in a corner office, a patent lawyer drafts yet another claim describing an adaptive bimetal clip with variable retention zones, and his draft itself ends up clamped to a folder by a 50-year-old steel clip that never read. A single spec, but still knows just how tight to hold. Pick up any fountain pen now and flex the clip gently. Feel the first resistance soft as the promise of rain followed by a firmer spine that says, quietly enough. That span, perhaps 1.15 newtons, perhaps a poetically vague 2 ounces, embodies centuries of shrugged compromises, caliper whispers, and spring tension lullabies. Slide it over a sheet of paper. Note how the clip leaves the faintest indentation, no deeper than a sigh. Release, and the metal returns home, unhurried yet certain. Let that certainty cradle your wandering thoughts tonight. Just firm enough to keep worries from falling loose, just gentle enough not to crease the dreamscape waiting in your pockets. You might not expect that the modest interval between 2 consecutive curls of notebook wire, the tiny gap where nothing at all happens, could summon drafting triangles, transatlantic cablegrams, and one short-lived craze for cinnamon-scented coils. Yet here we are, gliding through the quietly measured saga of spiral binding pitch. If you're still awake by the time an earnest Swiss designer declares that 4 loops per inch feel as reassuring as a dozing sheepdog, feel free to subscribe or simply let your eyelids follow the gentle helix downward. The wire will keep twirling regardless of applause dot in a sunlit print shop of the 1890s. Ledgers lie open like unfinished accordion music. Sheets are stitched, glued, even stabbed with brass brads that pinch margins into permanent frowns. A tinkerer named William Mudge bends piano wire around a dowel, punches matching holes in a stack of orders, and threads the coil through with the giddy care of buttoning a baby's coat. He files a patent describing elastic metallic spine, then estimates spacing by the width of his thumbnail, roughly 4 turns per inch, because thumbnails travel conveniently. Clerks adore how pages now lie perfectly flat, as if exhausted. By arithmetic, bookkeepers praise the coil's loyalty through countless tally marks. Yet across the channel, a Paris stationer, suspicious of imperial thumbs, chooses 3 turns per inch to match the breadth of his mustache comb. Customers debate gently. 4-pitch notebooks flex like sleepy accordions. 3-pitch notebooks resemble stoic ladders. A micro hook floats past every half minute. A Belgian poet buys both and discovers the narrower pitch hums faintly when flipped, inspiring a stanza about wire seeing the alphabet backward. Steam presses multiply. So, do coils. American binderies adopt a 4-to-1 pitch because their hole punches already nibble 1/4 inch apart for telephone manuals. British factories compromise at 3.5-to-1, printed in catalogs as 7 holes to 2 inches because fractions wearing hats look scholarly. German engineers, enamored with metric tidiness, drill 8 millimeters between bites, yielding a pitch of roughly 3.175-to-1 numbers, precise enough to make coffee shiver. Somewhere a Swedish procurement officer attempts to order coils from London, only to discover the holes resemble polite freckles rather than the confident dimples his paper expects. He responds by inserting tiny cardboard spacers, inadvertently inventing the doodle strip later found in teenage margins worldwide. Electric punches arrive in the 1930s, their motors buzzing like patient wasps. Operators calibrate sliding guides with brass vernier scales, yet still rely on pocket rulers to reassure the soul. Industry journals print coil tension graphs plotted against pitch, dense turns 5-to-1, promise page permanence. but demand wrist acrobatics to open. Loose turns 2.5 to 1. Flirt with flirtation itself, allowing pages to escape under nothing more than a desk fan's sigh. An Ohio laboratory strap springs to page edges, then jiggles them at 60 hertz until coils squeal. Charts conclude that 4 to 1 survives 10,000 jiggles before fatigue. 3 to 1 survives 12,000 but stiffens like day-old licorice. The lab recommends select pitch by ambient wiggle, a phrase quietly adopted by dance instructors but ignored by accountants. Wartime. Rationing reallocates steel. Coils pivot to aluminium, lighter but prone to memory loss. To maintain grip, engineers reduce pitch to 2.5 to 1, allowing each thicker loop to clasp the necks like cautious hikers on a foggy ridge. Soldiers tuck field notes into breast pockets. Coils compress, rebound, remember. After peace, steel returns, yet aluminium remains popular among students who legend claims twirls spare loops into impromptu. Antennae for clandestine radio homework. Publishers introduce dual-pitch notebooks, 3 turns per inch near the spine for strength, 5 toward the edge for flexibility. Reviewers call them topographic wonders, though most readers simply enjoy that pages surrender to folding without audible complaint. Computers sneak in, promising paperless clarity, yet printouts multiply, demanding binders vigorous enough. To corral spreadsheets. Office superstores codify 2 pitches, 6 millimeters, approximately 4 to 1, marketed as standard, and 9 millimeters, about 3 to 1, marketed as premium, though the premium merely adds a whisper of brass alloy. Instruction manuals advise selecting pitch based on sheet count. Under 90 pages, use standard. Above, choose premium. Above 200, surrender to 3-ring binders and hope. A micro hook surfaces 1 Kansas school district orders. PREMA pitch for every workbook, only to discover first graders enjoy uncoiling the wider wire into toy springs. The following year, they revert to standard, citing curricular integrity. Designers of disc-bound systems briefly taunt coils, offering mushroom slots requiring no pitch at all. But disc pages wobble under highlighter zeal, and coils stage. A polite comeback branded living hinge technology, though nothing living nor hinged appears. Startup companies laser cut holes shaped like teardrops, allowing coils of variable pitch within a single notebook, 5 to 1 near the top margin for lecture density, 3 to 1 near the bottom for contemplative spacing. Crowdfunding videos show pages flipping with balletic swagger. Backers nod, wallets open, shipping delays ensue. Coils eventually arrive smelling pleasantly of anxious cardboard. Modern ISO whispers suggest hole centers be 6.95 millimeters from the edge and spaced exactly a 1/4 inch apart for A-series sheets. Meanwhile, North American ANSI politely insists on 0.247 inches to align with digital punch coordinates. Software templates embed invisible grids, so printers know where to bite. Users rarely see these phantom lattice, yet every coil trusts them. Laser-hardened steel now forms loops chilled by nitrogen fog. Technicians measure pitch with digital microscopes that report decimals down to tiers of angels. Values still. Wander, 4.9 to 1 for miniature planners, 3.8 for art folios. The classic 4.0 for grocery notebooks, hoping their parsley list stays put. A micro hook glides by. A Japanese stationery reviewer rates notebook flips per second, awarding 5 stars to any coil, allowing 60 flips before snare harder. Then it sounds when daylight feels slow dot, pick up any spiral notebook and watch the coil glint. Count 4 turns within an inch. Your cradling tradition traced to a jeweler's thumbnail. Count 3. You share an artifact with mustache combs and ball-bearing trials. Count something deliciously awkward like 3.6. You are holding bureaucracy negotiated into wire. Run a fingertip along the valley between loops. Each gap holds a breath of stillness, a corridor where pages can whisper secrets without eavesdropping metal. Let your own thoughts thread gently through those intervals, looping once, twice, until worries lie flat, every edge aligned. The coil will keep its spiral, patient and precise, gripping just tight enough that nothing essential slips free before morning. You might not expect that the faint, glossy band shimmering along the top of a pastel square, the adhesive strip of an ordinary sticky note, could launch laboratory sprints. Conference syllabi measured in millimeters and a brief vogue for bergamot-scented tack, yet here we are, drifting gently through the measured hush of adhesive width history. If you are still awake by the time an earnest Montreal chemist suggests the perfect strip feels no wider than a courteous whisper, feel free to subscribe, but honestly, the notes will keep clinging without the encouragement of statistics. Hush settles over a Minnesota research bench in 1968, where a chemist named Spencer Silver mixes acrylate spheres so microscopically hollow they seem to float in curiosity alone. His colleague, Art Fry, plucks a test sample, strokes it onto the edge of a hymn book marker, and discovers the strip holds just long enough to reassure a tenor lost in the third verse. That proto-bookmark measures roughly half an inch wide, because scissors happen to land there. No ruler judges, yet the dimension quietly imprints itself onto memory. Early office trials snip narrower slivers 3/8 of an inch to save adhesive, but secretaries complain their reminders curl like timid fern fronds. Wider experiments, 2/3 of an inch prove too eager. Pages stick to one another as though forging accidental treaties. The balance of peel and perch, as the lab notebooks phrase it, appears to live in the untroubled pasture of 5/8. Engineers nod. Marketers round to exactly 15 millimeters, claiming metric rhythm harmonizes with fluorescent lighting. Somewhere a piano tuner affixes a sample to middle C and notes neither pitch nor page wavers, coining the first metaphorical measure of hold tempo. Pilot batches sail out in muted sunshine yellow, the color borrowed from legal pads that once hid nicotine smudges. Office clerks greet the novelty with cautious pressing, one finger at center, thumb for security, a ceremonious sigh as paper obliges. Almost immediately a question flutters across phone lines. How much glue is too much glue? One bank in Des Moines files a report noting that 6 millimeters of adhesive along the top edge balances discretion and loyalty. Pages lift when summoned, yet leave no tacky aftertaste. A rival firm in Cleveland speculates that 8 millimeters ensures memos survive the shiver of air conditioning vents. They commission a wind tunnel, tiny notes pinwheeling like pastel, snow, each rescued by interns wielding lacrosse nets. Findings recommend 7 millimeters precisely between opinions. Interns celebrate by attaching congratulatory notes to every stapler in sight, observing none drift beyond retrieval distance. Thus, a consensus yawns into existence. Between 6 and 8 millimeters is civilized. But consensus rarely naps long. By 1983, European distributors flirt with 10 millimeter tack, citing breezy train carriages and waffling desk fans. German typists appreciate the heft. French archivists protest adhesive shadows on onion skin carbon copies. Meetings convene in conference rooms where walls bloom with multicolored rectangles clinging like optimistic postage stamps. Representatives score each strip on a scale of tap and trust to peel with apologies. Minutes record an audible at 7.5 millimeters, the sound of bureaucracy tilting its head. Meanwhile, an Italian stationery designer sneaks bergamot oil into the adhesive batch, arguing scent aids memory. Tests confirm noses twitch agreeably, but the oil softens acrylic microspheres, causing notes to slump after 48 hours. The scented experiment lingers only in nostalgic footnotes. Yet the width used, precisely 7 millimeters, earns a cameo whenever fragrance. Enthusiasts recall lost prototypes, scene shifts to a silicon bright. Design studio in the late 1990s. Computer monitors glow, yet corkboards refuse to retire. Digital font samples still require tactile comparison. Designers crave slimmer borders for minimalism, so adhesive retreats to 5 millimeters, unveiling taller writing real estate like a raised stage. Product photos glamorize negative space, but shipping departments report notes arriving with corners pre-curling as though rehearsing escape. Consumer hotlines log a soft chorus of "my note foul" that grows louder each humid summer afternoon. Within 2 quarters, the strip cautiously regains a millimeter, returning to the familiar plateau of 6. Marketers christen the minor increase. Stay Flat Plus, providing a comforting illusion of advancement, while factory rollers simply readjust blade guides by the width of an agreeable. Raindrop Dot enter touch screen tablets and cloud reminders. Analysts predict the death of adhesive memory, yet conference rooms stubbornly bloom anew, this time with collaborative brainstorm mosaics. Facilitators require sticks that survive multiple relocations, from mainboard to subcluster to maybe later column, often under sweaty brainstorming palms. Scientists coated in lap goggles measure peel cycles with robotic arms. They discover that 8 millimeter strips endure 10 resticks before fatigue. 5 millimeter strips wilt at 6 cycles, bowing like tired violins. Consensus drifts upward again lower than 10, higher than 6, floating serenely at 7-ish, where it lands like a feather on water. A micro hook nods by. A Japanese Kanban coach insists on 6.7 millimeters because numbers divisible by 3 invite harmony. Team velocity charts apparently improve, though skeptics whisper correlation meets placebo. Eco design arrives on recycled wheat straw fibers. Natural starch adhesives swell in humidity, shrinking effective width by stealth. Manufacturers widen the initial coating to 9 millimeters, anticipating contraction, only to find winter offices parch instead, leaving chunky glue ridges that crackle under fingernails. The compromise becomes 7+ coating shrug, recorded in spec sheets as target 7 millimeters plus or minus the weather. Quality inspectors slide calipers across every 10th batch, jotting decimals in notebooks wider than the discrepancy. An auditor once calculates adhesive occupies exactly 5% of total note mass, and the statistic migrates into marketing copy where it wears a pearl grin. 95% pure idea space. Few readers know the remaining 5% has been argued. Over in conference halls, longer than most employees have sharpened pencils. Hold a modern sticky note now, any hue you like. Examine the strip, perhaps translucent, slightly shiny, whispering of acrylic and gravity. Count if curiosity remains. 6 millimeters, maybe 7 in a slip. Press it to a surface. Feel the first hush of contact, the gentle surrender of air. As the microspheres cup texture, lift again, a soft peel, the sound of distant pages turning themselves. That cling, the measured dance between staying and letting go, has wandered up and down millimeters for half a century, guided by thumbs, breezes, and the memory of humming hymnals. Let that balanced grip reassure your thoughts tonight, firm, enough to keep dreams in sight, gentle enough to release them come daylight. And should drowsiness settle in the moment the strip breathes against paper, know that every incremental width debate has led precisely here toward a whisper wide. Line of hold, perfectly proportioned for the slow, pleasing descent of sleep. You might not expect that the faint quarter circle shaved from each corner of an index card, the tiny arc where a crisp right angle once stood, could summon. Draftsmen with brass radius gauges provoke stationary guilds to debate half millimeter increments and spark a short-lived fashion for lemon-scented corner rounding knives. Yet here we are, drifting unhurriedly through the gently curving saga of index card corner radii. If you're still awake by the time a Copenhagen librarian insists that a 3mm arc promotes serenity during cataloging, feel free to subscribe. Though, much like the corners themselves, this monologue prefers not to press too hard for commitment. The story begins in the 1860s, when American clerks cut ledger leftovers into hand-sized rectangles to track shipments of whale oil. Their scissors, dulled by twine and boredom, left nicks along every edge, so a Boston stationer hired a tinsmith to build a simple punch. 2 crescent blades set in a hinged block of maple. The blades traced a radius equal to the width of the tinsmith's. Little finger about 4mm, but no one bothered to name the measure. They merely admired that cards no longer snagged in pockets. Across the Atlantic, French notaries, suspicious of Yankee fingerdom, filed their corners with pocket knives, shaving wider arcs near 5.5mm, which they claimed helped the cards slip into silk waistcoat slots. Debates arose in tea rooms. Did wider curves suggest continental flair, or merely hint that the clerk was hiding torn evidence? A micro hook glides past. One Southampton broker mailed himself 24 cards of both styles and concluded, in a letter now archived in crumbs, that French corners felt optimistically flirtatious, while Boston corners felt starchily decisive. As card catalogs spread like patient ivy through libraries, curvature acquired gospel status. Melville Dewey, fond of decimal order and gentle consonants, commissioned a steel die to trim his cards with a precise 3mm radius, reasoning that anything larger wasted space a scandal when drawers measured only a hair wider than ambition. Operators of the Library Bureau followed suit, stamping millions of cards whose corners matched Dewey's spectacles and modest understatement. Meanwhile, German archivists, enamored with durability, lobbied for 2mm arcs, arguing that smaller bites left more cellulose to fend off the rising tide of finger grease. Early card file engineers tested the theories by blowing fans across drawers and counting the cards that fluttered free. Reports suggest no card escaped, but the flutter counters enjoyed steady employment. In London, a printer with a taste for compromise split the difference at 4mm and labeled his product Universal Friendly Curve. Customers purchased out of curiosity, only to discover the radius fell exactly where pencil shavings like to nestle, creating what one clerk called corner conservatories. These discoveries sound weighty, but in the end, libraries simply ordered whichever radius glowed cheapest under gaslight. Come the 1920s. Automated corner rounders clattered behind shop windows. Presses stamped arcs like biscuit cutters, each punch accompanied by a faint sigh of cellulose surrender. Factory managers, forever friends with fractions, codified 3 radii, 1/8" 3-ish for petite cards, 3/16 inch 5 for sturdy ledger stock, and the daring 1/4 inch 6+ for decorators of scrapbooks and sentimental ephemera. Marketing leaflets touted the safe pocket promise. Larger arcs wouldn't jab gentle fabric, smaller arcs wasted less pulp. Typists sent postcards to each other comparing slide smoothness. One claimed the 1/8 inch radius felt like running a finger along the smile of a polite stranger. Another called 1/4 inch corner slippers for pages, while nobody wrote stirring verse about 3/16 inch at all, proving middle children everywhere deserve sympathy. Micro Hook, a Chicago salesman leaving for lunch, dropped 3 card samples in a puddle. The smallest cornered card curled first, inspiring him to champion larger radii in rainy climates, a crusade lasting precisely until September dryness. Wartime paper thrift trimmed dreams and corners. Factory shrank radius choice to match. Russian book margins, 2mm saved adhesive, saved steel, saved face. Cards emerge with crisp stings of angle disguised by whisper of curve. Librarians tape their fingertips to avoid paper kisses. Post-war plenty widened corners. Again, like hymns loosening after ration belts. Card drawers inhaled the extra millimeters with audible relief. A Swedish standards board convened in 1957 and proposed a docile 4mm default, printing the suggestion in booklets no one translated. Yet the number sailed by word of mouth into Japanese stationery houses, which refined dyes until they cut arcs so smooth mirrors envied them. Japan exported gentle arc 4mm packs in pastel apricot, and for a decade the world accepted 4 as the unspoken lullaby of radius measurement. Some were an Italian index card enthusiast, formed a club dedicated to comparing corner radii by candlelight. Minutes reveal they rarely agreed on exactness, but always served biscotti of identical curvature. Computers threatened paper in the 80s, but corporate training manuals still multiplied on cardstock. A Silicon Valley intern measured how many pixels fit inside various arc sizes and argued that 3mm corners best matched 12-point Monaco font aesthetics. His memo circulated without memo corners because digital printouts sliced squares. The irony led to a tiny resurgence of square-cornered cards among software startups, who claimed right angles celebrated the edge of innovation. Within months, those cards caught on jeans rivets and tore. Complaints mounted. Curved dies returned, now cut by laser. Radius adjustable from 1.5 to 6mm by turning a brass collar marked like a sleepy abacus. Quality control technicians pressed cards against velvet drums. Timing the whisper as corners glided across cloth longer whispers meant wider radii. They recorded data on more cards, of course, then rounded those cards' corners at the consensus 4mm mark before filing them beneath a tab labeled oral results, where the cards still hung when drawers closed with proper Hush.eco designers of the 2000s. Swapped bleached pulp for straw fiber, whose rougher edge chipped unless the radius widened to at least 5mm. Product sheets thus listed dual specs: sustainability radius 5mm, classic radius 3mm. Conferences displayed sample drawers where alternating curves resembled grinning piano keys. Delegates flicked through and timed page turns, discovering that larger arc shaves 0.2 seconds for retrieval, a statistic celebrated in keynote slides for exactly 1/4 before coffee break erased memory. Yet minimalists countered with ultra-small 2mm corners on recycled bamboo cards, arguing the austere arc whispered humility. Bloggers hosted polls. Votes split precisely between extremes. Comment sections, thankfully, remained. More curved than sharp dot hold an index card now and inspect its corner. Perhaps the curve arcs like the moon's fingernail at first 3mm. Maybe 4 if the press enjoyed its lunch. Run a thumb along that subtle slope and feel the page yield without snag. Under lamplight, the edge may cast a smile-shaped shadow that never quite touches the ruled line. If you stack several cards, the curves form a shoreline where thoughts may stroll barefoot, safely free from jagged right angles. Those measured arcs, tiny, deliberate, faint as polite laughter, have traveled from whale oil invoices to digital to-do lists, adjusting by fractions while remaining steadfast in purpose, to let ideas slide past one another without catching breath. Let your own thoughts adopt such curvature now, rounding off their corners until every sharp concern softens into quiet drift. The radius, whether 2 or 5mm, is precisely as generous as tonight requires, just curved enough to usher you toward the gentle horizon where tasks lose corners, and sleep, like a well-rounded card, settles perfectly in place. You might not expect that the tiny ring of metal hugging a pencil's painted shaft, the ferrule that keeps the eraser from roaming, could inspire factory gong tests at dawn. Correspondence measured in crimp counts, and one oddly fragrant Experiment involving vanilla-infused brass, yet here we are, gliding through the measured hush of ferrule-length history. If you happen to remain awake by the time a Birmingham engineer proposes that 8 crimps feel as reassuring as a well-behaved heartbeat, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the pencil roll a little closer to sleep. Its ferrule will keep holding the eraser without notice. A lamplit workshop in 1858 sets the shavings for our tale. Hyman Lipman, filing his famous combination pencil and rubber patent, attaches the eraser with glue alone generous, sticky, and brave. Early adopters find that summer heat melts the adhesive into pocket-sized tragedies, so a Massachusetts tinsmith bends a narrow sleeve of thin brass, slips it over wood and rubber, and squeezes 2 discrete crimps with pliers borrowed from watchmaking. The sleeve measures just over a 1/4 inch long, because that is as far as the tinsmith's pliers can comfortably reach. 2 crimps prove enough for gentle note-taking, but students flick their pencils like miniature batons and report erasers sailing into Dust Bowl constellations. A 3rd crimp is added purely out of caution, and 3 soon becomes the folk. Number for trustworthiness? Across the Atlantic, a French stationer, ever stylish, elongates the sleeve to a daring 10 millimeters and decorates it with faint ridges. Claiming the extra length reminds users of Persian colonnades. British librarians, fond of understatement, trim theirs back to 8, fearing extravagance might encourage careless rubbing. Thus begins an unhurried seesaw, length versus elegance, crimp versus calm. Steam presses arrive, stamping ferrules from flat ribbon faster than conversation. American factories standardize on 3/4 inch blanks rolled into cylinders whose seams overlap like shy secret handshakes. A patent file from 1879 specifies exactly 12 ribs along the ferrules body so fingers can locate orientation in the dark drawers of bookkeeping. Rivals counter with 10 ribs, advertising less friction in dusty climates, though dust rarely consults brochures. Meanwhile, crimp machinery evolves. Foot-powered presses with butterfly cams squeeze 4, then 6, then 8 jaws in. 1 soft clomp. Operators discover 8 crimps leave a pleasing dandelion pattern on spent rubbers, used by children as improvised rosette stamps on margins. A micro hook drifts by. A Kansas teacher offers extra credit for homework adorned with perfect ferrule rosettes, inadvertently producing the first stationary-based grading curve. When pencils conquer telegraph offices, clerks demand longer ferrules to survive the drumbeat of message scribbling. Engineers oblige with 1-inch sleeves crimped 10 times, marketing them as signal safe. Yet maritime merchants find the extra brass tarnished under salt air, staining cuffs with melancholic green. Chemists experiment with nickel plating, which adds brightness but stiffens the sleeve, causing crimps to crack if pressed beyond 7. The recommended crimp count slides back again, leaving one shipping fleet faithfully ordering pencils with 7.5 crimps, an impossibility achieved by alternating full and half impressions. A compromise which inspectors quietly ignore. Depression-era thrift. TRIM's ferrule length to conserve metal, down to 5/8 of an inch, then a modest half. Manufacturers tout short but stalwart sleeves, while substituting cheaper PINK eraser clay that crumbles sooner but costs less than coffee. To hide crumble lines, designers widen ferrule diameter by a sliver, allowing more rubber to nest inside like a modest cushion. The fit proves cozy, breakage rates fall. Length stabilizes at 13 millimeters for an odd little decade. Factories inscribe patent numbers on the flank row after row of minuscule optimism, though students carve them into pseudo-ciphers during slow geography recitations. One Minnesota boy allegedly decodes a lunch schedule from his dustmate's pencil, demonstrating that boredom can fit inside anything, even 13 millimeters. War rationing returns brass to bullets, so pencils were aluminium ferrules, light, proud, quick to dent. To prevent collapse under enthusiastic erasing, crimp count shrinks to 4 broad bites. Guidelines caution operators not to crease more than 20% of circumference, less metal shear. Inspectors carry pliable go. Gauges shaped like sleepy commas. By 1944, some factories embed tiny cardboard liners between eraser and ferrule wall, calling them shock absorbers, though they mostly buffer rumors of shortage. Post-war prosperity restores brass and unwraps color, gold tint, silver. Flash, even robin egg blue lacquer to match suburban kitchens. Ferrule length settles back near 3/4 of an inch. Crimp count steadies at 6-2 front, 2 back, 2 side mimicking the embrace of polite handshakes. The 1960s usher in vinyl erasers, bringy, dustless, faintly smelling of new sneakers. Vinyl's slipperiness persuades engineers to lengthen ferrules once more by 2 millimeters, ensuring rubber does not slide out like a startled cork. A Californian surfer-turned-designer suggests slotting wave-like flutes along the sleeve. The pattern catches marketing flicker, but complicates die tooling, so prototypes remain in beachside rumor. Instead, factories adopt micro-serrations around ferrule rims, guaranteeing grip without extra length. Technical sheets reassure buyers that 8 crimps at 2 degrees deeper compression suffice for vinyl. Schools test batches and declare no visible casualties except for the occasional pencil used as impromptu drumstick during marching band traffic. Computer-aided design in the 80s allows ferrule dies to sculpt elegant scallops. Clipboards appreciate the flourish, even if users rarely notice. ISO murmurs a suggestion. Ferrules should enclose erasers no less than 60% of their height and no more than 90%, leaving designer discretion. The document lists a comfortable median of 72%, about 11.5 millimeters for standard pink plugs. Factories already cutting 12 millimeter sleeves smile and keep cutting. A Japanese stationery giant conducts blind pinch tests, discovering that users guess pencil quality based on ferrule weight. They respond by infusing brass with 2% tin, lowering density just enough to hint at agility without triggering suspicion. To celebrate, they emboss 7-minute stars between crimps, invisible without magnification but delightful to anyone discovering them during a long phone hold. Eco-minded designers in the 2000s swap metal for blissfully compostable PLA polymer. Early polymer ferrules crack if crimped more than 5 times, forcing a return to the 1960s 4 crimp pattern, wider jaws, shallower bites. Polymers mold in any hue. Someone chooses translucent jade, and accountants notice green pencils disappear fastest, perhaps to indoor plants craving companionship. Polymer's flexibility allows slightly shorter sleeves, down to 11 millimeters, because the material flexes around swelling rubber during humid summers. ISO updates guidelines. Metal ferrule 12 plus or minus 1 millimeter. Polymer 11 plus or minus 1 millimeter. Crimp count 4 to 8. Tight enough to resist 3 kilograms axial pull. Most people read only the preface and a charming footnote about avoiding citrus cleaners. As acids unsettle polymer dyes. Pick up a pencil, now maybe hexagonal cedar, maybe smooth resin. Feel the ferrule's little cylinder press against your fingertip. Count the crimps, perhaps 6 neat scallops, or 8 eager bites, or the nostalgic 4 of thrift. Measure, if you must, with the whispering edge of a thumbnail. Is it half an inch? 12 millimeters? 11 and change. Wherever it lands, the length carries a century of modest negotiations between sturdiness and poise. Press the eraser, sense. The sleeve's silent certainty holding rubber in place, neither too tight to bruise, nor too loose to wander. That measured grip has guarded mistakes through exams, grocery lists, and bedside scribbles of half-remembered dreams. Let it cradle your own drifting thoughts tonight, firm enough to keep them until morning, gentle enough not to leave marks. And as the ferrule's softly curved crimps glint once in lamplight before lids lower, remember that entire committees once debated those tiny arcs. Also, sleep might arrive supported by the quietest of hardware.